Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to preview Week 17 of the DFS main slate. It's a bigger main slate than we've had the past couple of weeks, Jared. No Detroit Dallas there on Saturday night. So, that's a bit of a bummer to not have those players available. No Joe Flacco, who's apparently the new king of NFL quarterbacks. No Packers Vikings, but the remaining 13 games all on the main slate, just 3 of those in the late window. So it's kind of an interesting setup for everything this week. Before we get to how that might affect selections, I know you had a pretty good week 16 on DraftKings, right?
Yeah, it was a really good week 16. It was one mistake away from being a great week for me. I ended up playing a Joe Flacco, Amari Cooper, David Njoku team that was up near the top for a while. My best team was actually a Nick Mullins, Justin Jefferson team with a Jahmyr Gibbs run back. And then I had the Mike Evans, Calvin Ridley mini stack that I think we talked about on that team. I didn't play that on the Flacco team, which hurt. But the big mistake was the fade of Breece Hall, which I think we talked about on the show, that we were kind of going to fade him at high ownership. I didn't think the Jets were willing to give him a massive workload this late in the season, which they did last week. They did again on Thursday night against the Browns. So that was one mistake. Not having Breece Hall was kind of what kept me from the top of the leaderboards. And then, man, that because I'm still not over it, that Bijan Robinson touchdown that wasn't. There are plays that will stick in my mind forever. That is one of them, because I was so heavily invested in Bijan. He's freaking wide open in the end zone, just lazily steps out of bounds before he catches the ball. So that one hurt. I mean, basically, playing Bijan and not Breece Hall was what potentially kept me from winning a tournament last week.
I mean, kind of a crazy turn for Breece Hall last week. The week before, he had 6 carries for 12 yards and 1 catch for 6. And then he goes 20, 95, and 2 on the ground, 12 catches for 96 yards. Another big one against the Browns. Sometimes it's just like, why do we even project this stuff? Why don't you just completely guess players and be like, that guy is good physically, I think I'll play him this week. It makes it feel like it's pointless sometimes, but we get back to it ultimately being pointful. Otherwise we wouldn't keep doing it.
Yeah, well, it's trying to get into coaches' heads, which is one of the hardest parts about what we have to do here, right? Because we know Breece Hall is awesome. We knew the matchup was awesome against Washington last week. I didn't think the Jets wanted to give this young building block coming off a knee injury in a lost season, 30 touches or whatever he ended up getting last week.
Why would you give Breece Hall 32 touches against Washington in week 15? But whatever. That's what happened week 16. So that's what happened, and we'll keep judging what happens as we project it forward. And obviously, we're going to go ahead and project for week 17 here. As usual, we'll start with DraftKings. If you're playing only on FanDuel and just looking for those picks, use the timestamps in the show notes below. You can skip right to where you want to be in the show. Jared, quarterback, here's what a goofy year we're working on at quarterback. I already mentioned Joe Flacco. Even without him on this DraftKings main slate, we have 4 quarterbacks in the 4K salary range leading our dollars per point this week. Usually if you have one of those guys, it's like, oh, there's a 4K quarterback this week to consider. We have 4 of them going on right now in week 17, including multiple teams switching starters. And even that doesn't include Jaren Hall, because he's on that Sunday night game against Green Bay. So are you using one of those guys at quarterback for cash, or are you going more expensive?
Yeah, I think there's multiple price ranges you can look at quarterback. And that's kind of the theme of this week, right? When we have 13 games on the slate, there's a ton of options. That's kind of the tricky part about this week is, whittling them down. I think you can play a cheap quarterback, but I think you can go up to Brock Purdy, the most efficient quarterback this year against the league's worst pass defense. As of now, I've settled with Derek Carr. This is definitely a week to fill in your quarterback spot near the end of your lineup, fill in the rest and then kind of see what fits a quarterback. The lineup I have right now for cash, I had the money to get to Derek Carr at 5,500. I just feel better about him than any of those sub 5K quarterbacks. Derek Carr coming off 2 of his better games of the season, 20.3 and then 29 DraftKings points in his last 2 games. He was 10th in PFF passing grade back in week 15. He was 5th last week. So he's, played well to go along with the fantasy production. And then he gets this Bucs defense. They're 24th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. Tampa's actually up to 13th in pass defense DVOA, but they're still 2nd in pass rate over expected against. That's the big thing here, is that teams don't want to run the ball against Tampa very much. So you get elevated pass volume. You do have the Saints road underdogs here. So I think Carr is going to throw it enough to, at least return cash game value at this price.
And New Orleans doesn't run the ball very well right now, so they should be leaning that way anyway. Are you pairing Derek Carr with a pass catcher here?
I actually am, because I really like Chris Olave, which we'll get to him in the cash section. Again, stacking is not a requirement in cash. It's kind of like if it works, it works, and it's better than not. I wouldn't shy away from it. But yeah, I do like Chris Olave as a pair with Carr.
Yeah, I would say don't force it, but it's certainly good if it does work out, because obviously it's the same reasoning as doing so in a tournament lineup. It's just one less bet to pick a quarterback and one of his top pass catchers. Tournament side,
I definitely want at least one Brock Purdy theme again. His price is finally up to $7K. I think it's like a fair price. It maybe keeps ownership down a little bit. Not that he's going to be sneaky, but I mean, just how good he's been all season against this Commanders defense has just been so bad all season. The tricky part is figuring out who to stack Brock Purdy with. I think that's probably a price thing and ownership thing. We'll see how that's shaking out by Sunday morning.
We'll move on to running back, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire leads the dollars per point projections, also leads the projected rostered rate, well ahead of Christian McCaffrey, who's number 2 in that category. And McCaffrey is then well ahead of number 3, Zeke Elliott. Is CEH a must for cash this week on DK, assuming, of course, that the illness that kept him out of Thursday's practice clears up?
I wouldn't quite call him a must. He's not at that level for me. I am going to play him though. I mean, I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer than that. I don't know. I'm getting old. Time flies. It might've been closer to 10 years ago, but there was a point where Le'Veon Bell and Todd Gurley were both like 9,000 something, and you just wanted to play both of them every week in cash. I feel like we're at that point with Christian McCaffrey and Kyren Williams at this point. And they both have excellent matchups this week. The Niners obviously against that Washington team, and then Kyren Williams gets the Giants. The Rams are big favorites there. So I want to play both of those stud backs in cash. And then, going down to Edwards-Helaire for the flex spot at 5,300 definitely helps you fit in the two high price guys. And with the CEH, it's really, I'll say strength of the offense. I know the Chiefs have been underwhelming. They still have a pretty high implied total this week though, but it's really the matchup against Cincinnati. I mean, the Bengals have allowed 30 plus points in 4 of their last 7 games now, including to the Steelers last week. They allowed 24 points in another one of those games. They're 28th in run defense DVOA. They're allowing 4.5 yards per carry to running backs on the season. So I'm just, I don't think Edwards-Helaire is good, but give me a 15 plus touch running back in this matchup, and I think he'll pay off in cash.
I believe it is 2017 that you were thinking about with Gurley and Le'Veon Bell. So that'd be 6 years ago. So slightly longer than you said initially, but less time than you worried that it might be. So maybe you're not quite as old as you think you are just yet, Jared, but you're well on your way with that second kid in the house now. I think that the high ownership plus Clyde Edwards-Helaire not being that good, plus the Chiefs being willing to lean away from the backfield when it makes sense, especially near the goal line, I think that all makes CEH a pretty easy tournament fade this week. What do you think?
I think so too. I mean, I might end up mixing him into a lineup that I think is pretty contrarian otherwise, because again, I do think the price tag helps open things up. But I'm going to be trying to fade Edwards-Helaire. So you have Devin Singletary and Javonte Williams are kind of the two guys in the same price range that I think, really could pretty easily outscore Edwards-Helaire. The problem with those two guys is they're both pretty chalky too. They're both coming in at 15 and 16% ownership for those two guys. So it makes them a bit less attractive, but I do think, just trying to pivot off Edwards-Helaire in most tournament teams is probably the best move.
I think Jaylen Warren at the same level of price, maybe Chuba Hubbard, we'll see. I would go those guys over Javonte Williams, who's just been terrible to the point that Denver's even leaned away from him some lately. But yeah, it's an interesting range at running back. And, I think it's at least important to think about alternatives to CEH. He seems obvious, but like I said, just because he's their top running back this week does not necessarily mean that he's in for even a touchdown.
For sure. Yep.
Wide receiver, we've got a couple of 4K wideouts up top in the lineup generator. Do we need to go that low, though, with CEH, with the cheap quarterbacks that we talked about? Are you looking for one of those 4K wideouts?
Yeah, I think if you want to play McCaffrey and Kyren Williams, you do need to play at least one of those cheap wide receivers. I like Demario Douglas down there. He has double-digit DraftKings points in 4 of his last 5 games now, 5 of his last 7. He's averaging 7.3 targets per game over that span. Pretty tough matchup against the Bills on Sunday, but the Patriots are obviously massive underdogs in that game. There should be passing volume. I don't think Douglas has much of a ceiling, but I think for cash games, he's a pretty good bet to give you 10 to 12 points, which is fine.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We could easily see him get 10, 11 targets, catch 6 balls for 52 yards. And, that's fine
Right.
for what we're paying for down here. What about tournament side of Whiteout?
I really want to get some Tyreek Hill. And I think Christian McCaffrey is a better straight up play at similar price range, but he's also going to be 2 to 3 times his own. We have Tyreek Hill projected for 12% ownership right now. You look at Tyreek versus McCaffrey on the season, Tyreek's averaging a half fewer point per game than McCaffrey, but Tyreek Hill has 6 games of 30 plus DraftKings points. McCaffrey has 3. Now McCaffrey has a bunch of others where he's at like 28, 29. So I'm not saying there's a big edge there, but I do think Hill has just as high a ceiling, if not higher. And then you also have Jalen Waddle probably going to miss this game. We saw Waddle, he missed week 3, that Broncos game where Miami put up 70. So who knows exactly how much stock to put into that. But Tyreek Hill in that game, he only ran 22 pass routes. He got 11 targets on those 22 pass routes, caught 9 of them for 157 yards and a score. That was obviously a game where, I don't think he played hardly at all in the fourth quarter. And, this game against Baltimore should be a lot more. So, there's a realistic chance that Hill gets like 15, 16 targets in this game without Waddle. And McDaniel has shown the ability to be able to scheme these guys up. Even like Jalen Waddle went off in that Jets game without Tyreek, right? Like McDaniel's shown the ability to scheme these guys open even when the other one is out. So I think Hill, has a chance to put up, one of those 30, 35 point games, and he's only projected for 12% ownership.
And frankly, I wouldn't even factor in the negative defensive matchup of Baltimore against Miami this week for Tyreek Hill. I mean, I know it's a tough pass defense, but there's no individual player that matches up well with Tyreek Hill. I mean, he can just beat whatever you have. We'll see exactly what's going on. Certainly possible at times for a defense to limit him, but I wouldn't go into a game thinking, Tyreek Hill's in trouble against this defense.
Yeah, I mean, Baltimore's 10th in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. They're also just 18th in yards per game allowed to opposing number 1 wide receiver, 73.5 per game. So it's not a horrible matchup for Tyreek Hill. It's definitely one he can win.
You got a run back on the other side of that one from the Baltimore side?
No, I don't think I'm going to get to much of that game. I know I was talking to you guys earlier this week. I actually bet the under 47. Actually, I do. I just think both defenses are very good. So the scoring might not be as high as people expect. So honestly, it's probably just going to be like just Tyreek Hill from that game for me. Fade the rest of it for the most part.
Tight end. Well, maybe we'll talk about a potential guy to run back in that game. But first, Chigakonkwo is tied with George Kittle for most popular tight end on the DK main slate as of right now. Should that be the case, Jared, or does that level of popularity make Okonkwo a fade?
He's been good for the past month or so now, and Houston is 30th in adjusted points allowed to tight end. So I don't think he's a bad play. I would try not to use him in tournaments of that ownership. I think he is in play for cash. I'm saying screw it at tight end. I'm playing Austin Hooper in cash at minimum price, 2,500. He does come in as our best dollars per point value at the position, despite being projected for just 7 PPR points. It's just the price tag. I'm so sick of paying, 3,600 for tight ends that end up scoring me like 6 points. I'll just pay $2,500 for Hooper and get 6 points out of him. He, with Michael Mayer out last week, and Mayer has not practiced yet this week, so I'm assuming he's going to miss again. Hooper caught just 2 of 3 targets, but Aiden O'Connell threw only 21 passes in that game. So it was a 14% target share for Austin Hooper. He ran a pass route on 75% of the dropback. So good usage for Hooper. This game against Indianapolis, should be more competitive. I expect more passes from the Raiders in this one. And the Colts are just 28th in adjusted points allowed to tight ends.
Yeah, it's a bad offense that I think you generally want to steer away from for tournament lineups, but it should be better than it was last week. So I am fine with that as well for the cost play. Isaiah Likely, you don't like him in this spot as the run back for the Tyreek Hill lineup?
He would be the run back for me if I wanted to do that. I mean, I think he is my favorite Raven. You have Zay Flowers dealing with some injury I can't think of the top of my head, but he hasn't practiced so far. I think it's a calf. So that makes him a bit iffier. And Likely's just been good. I think you can attack Miami with tight ends. So 46 is a bit pricey. Actually, my favorite tournament play at tight end is Dallas Goedert, who is right there in the same range at $4,800, just 5% projected ownership. I think you ideally want to get an Eagle in your lineups this week, right? I mean, they have the second highest implied total on the main slate. I think DeAndre Swift is in play. I think Dallas Goedert, though, might be the best value among the Eagles at $4,800. Goedert has 9 targets in 2 straight games now. Arizona's 5th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends, but they faced the 4th fewest tight end targets, which is, why that's the case, why they haven't allowed fantasy points. Arizona's actually 30th in tight end coverage DVOA. So it's not a matchup I'm scared of with Goddard. I think, all these Eagles have big touchdown upside in this matchup.
Yeah, his targets have been good since he came back. The only concern is that, other guys do the scoring, but, we can't be sure of that heading into a game. Now, how much would it influence you in building this lineup, choosing between Dallas Goedert, Isaiah Likely at the same salary level to already have Tyreek Hill in the lineup, or if you already have an Arizona Cardinal in the lineup? How much of a factor is that, both here and just kind of in general? Like how much do you let that decide which players you're choosing in the same salary range, or are you primarily looking for your favorite plays?
Yeah, it's a balancing act. Sometimes I feel like my lineups are almost like too correlated, where I'll just like make sure I have like a mini stack and all that stuff. So like I'm trying to almost get away from that a little bit. It's a good tiebreaker. Like for me in this case with Likely versus Goddard, I would rather get an Eagle in my lineup than like mini stack that Ravens Dolphins game. So that's why like in this case I would break ties in favor of Goddard. But in a lot of other cases I would go with the stack in a situation like that.
Yeah, I would say in general, it's good to, if the players are close, go with the one that has that correlation. I think that's probably something we should do more in general in setting our redraft lineups. Cause that's why it makes sense for a DFS lineup, is if you're betting on that game, then it's less of a bet to take somebody else that can benefit from that game going in the way that you're hoping it's going to. Right. So, one of those things that you first think about in DFS that maybe you can then take back and apply to your regular fantasy play. Flex on DraftKings this week. What are you looking at?
Yeah, so I mentioned DeAndre Swift. He's one of my favorite tournament plays at running back, and definitely someone you can go with the third running back, use him in flex. We have Philadelphia's 12-point home favorites with a 30-point implied total, so a nice environment for a running back. Arizona is not good against any position defensively. They're worst against running backs, though. They're 31st in adjusted points allowed to running backs. They're 31st in run defense DVOA on the season. They're 32nd in run defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks. And DeAndre Swift is just in for positive touchdown regression. How many times has this guy been tackled at the 1 yard line this season? And then Jalen Hurts comes in and just, tush pushes his way in for the touchdown. But DeAndre Swift has 8.1 expected rushing touchdowns. That's 8th most among running backs. He has only 5 actual rushing touchdown. So he is in for some regression there. This is a good spot for it to hit. Like I think he has multiple touchdown upside in this game.
And I think the Cardinals have lost about 40 front 7 players to injury. So a weak defense further weakened by that. You got somebody else for tournament at flex?
Jackson Smith-Njigba is someone I'm looking at this week, really both for cash and tournaments. So he's $4,800. So I do think, if you're looking for a cheap wide receiver, like he's a bit more expensive than Demario Douglas, but $500 more if you can find it. I'd rather play JSN. And then he's only 4% projected ownership, so I think he's in play for tournaments as well. JSN has 29 targets over the last 4 games. That's 4 fewer than Tyler Lockett, but it's 4 more than DK Metcalf. The Steelers are down to 21st in pass defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks, so it's not a scary matchup for JSN. So I like him for tournaments. And then one last guy I wanted to throw out, Joe Mixon, 1% projected ownership. He's been quiet the past 2 weeks, but he had 21 plus DraftKings points in 3 of his previous 4 before that. And I just want to keep attacking this Chiefs run defense. They gave up another big game last week to Zamir White. The Chiefs are 29th in run defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks, giving up 5.2 yards per carry to running backs. The concern with Mixon is obviously that the Bengals are pretty big underdogs here. They fall behind. But I think if they have a chance in this game, it's going to be with Mixon on the ground, because it's looking like you're going to have no Jamar Chase again.
Yeah, and you mentioned Mixon being quieter over the past 2 weeks. The carries have been down in those 2 games, but it is just 2 games. He had 21 and 19 carries the 2 games before that. Right. They're on the road at Kansas City. I would think that they would try to, use Joe Mixon at least early in that game, as long as they're able to. So that looks like an opportunity as opposed to a player to be worried about. That low projected ownership on Mixon, the role that should be there. Not guaranteed, but should be bigger than it was the past 2 weeks. I like the mix and play in that spot. Defense, the ownership looks pretty spread around based on the projections at this point in the week. And we've got 4 2K salary options among the top 5 in our DK dollars per point. Where are you favoring defense?
Yeah, I love those cheap defenses. For me, I'm really just focused on Denver and Baltimore, who we do have as our top 2 values at defense by a pretty significant margin. And Denver is a top value by a significant margin, even over Baltimore. They'll be who I likely using cash at $2,900. Just, at home, favorites at home to Easton Stick. The Chargers have a 16-point implied total. Easton Stick has a 10% sack rate through his 3 appearances now. So just a good spot for Denver. And then Baltimore, I definitely prefer for tournaments. Tough matchup beyond paper against Miami. They just had a tough matchup on paper against San Francisco last week, scored 15 DraftKings points in that game. Baltimore has 11 plus DraftKings points in 8 of their 15 games this season. It's just been an excellent fantasy defense. They're cheap. Right now we have them at just 6% ownership. So if it stays in that range, I think they're the best tournament play by a pretty big margin.
Denver feels like a better play because you would think that there's much less likelihood of Easton Stick leading a big offensive day than Tua and Tyreek Hill and the Miami offense. But I certainly can't bet against Baltimore after they went to San Francisco and dominated the 49ers. Jared's got more picks and analysis available for you in his weekly cash game and tournament articles for DK on draftsharks.com. So check those out now. We are going to switch over for now to the FanDuel side, and the week 17 FanDuel main slate. Jared, at quarterback, Lamar Jackson is cheaper than Patrick Mahomes, Justin Fields, and other quarterbacks for some reason, because he's third among main slate QBs in FanDuel points per game for the year. So I'm not really sure why the salary doesn't match up with that, but it has him topping our dollars per point. And he has outscored his own FanDuel point average in 3 of the past 5 games. So it's not even like we're coming off a cold streak and we have to worry about him. Is it Lamar Jackson starting your cash lineup?
Hey, your new MVP favorite, Lamar Jackson. I think if he beats Miami on Sunday, he's going to win the MVP. I'm playing him in cash. And I actually really respect this Dolphins defense. If you just look over the last 5 weeks, Miami is 5th in total defensive DVOA. I already mentioned I bet this game to go under, so I don't love the game, but I think for cash on FanDuel at this price tag, you just have to play Lamar Jackson. He's just underpriced by at least like $500 or $600, I think.
And, especially if you look at the dollars per point, the several guys behind him are more expensive. So you have to reach past this group of potential studs to find something, truly cheaper if you want it. Tournament side, where you're looking at quarterback.
Yeah, I want some exposure to Patrick Mahomes in tournaments this week. I think he's tough to play on DraftKings. He's really expensive. It's tough to, make him work in a lineup that feels optimal. I think he's a much better play on FanDuel here at $8,000. He actually comes in as our second best value at the position. It's really just, one to play on Patrick Mahomes, so I still think is, one of the best or second best quarterback in the NFL. But then it's this Bengals defense, which just gave up a big game to, Mason Rudolph and the Steelers. That's kind of all you need to say. The Bengals are 29th in defensive DVOA over the last 5 weeks. They are 29th in pass defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks. I mentioned the big game to Mason Rudolph. The game before that, they gave up 303 yards and 2 touchdowns to Nick Mullins. So if Mahomes is going to have, a vintage Mahomes, 30-point fantasy game, I think it's going to come this week. And I want to have at least some exposure to him.
Joe Flacco's been awesome, Jared, but I think it's a little bit premature to say that Patrick Mahomes is the second best quarterback just because of that now. Running back. Actually, no, before we get to running back, you need to play either Rashee Rice or Travis Kelce with Mahomes in those tournament lineups, right? Maybe both.
Yes, I think Kelce would be my first guy in because the Bengals are dead last in adjusted points allowed to tight ends. But I think you could probably afford to even stack them both up, which I think would be viable because it's a pretty concentrated offense at this point, right? Rashee Rice is getting double-digit targets weekly at this point. I think Travis Kelce is a good bet for 8 to 10 targets in this game. So I think double stacking them is probably the best move.
Yeah, and Kelce's not going to sneak up on anybody, but his ownership is down a bit from where it would have been had he been producing like the usual Travis Kelce to this point. So I think probably the way to differentiate the Mahomes-Kelce stack, which is always going to be popular when it makes sense, is to add Rice, which would be less popular. Yep. Running back now, we've got Kyren Williams up to $9,400. Only Christian McCaffrey is more expensive among running backs on FanDuel at $11K. Williams leads in dollars per point. McCaffrey's third. Which of these guys are you smashing into your cash lineup on FanDuel?
If you look at our dollars per point rankings, there's really like 4 guys that stand above everyone else, and it's Kyren McCaffrey, it's Rachaad White, and it's Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So I really think you're picking 3 of those 4 guys. McCaffrey is just really tough to get in there and make work. Like it's tough to even play like Lamar Jackson. You almost have to go cheaper at quarterback. You got to play a couple of cheap wide receivers to make McCaffrey work. So I'm probably going to go with the other 3 guys. I think to me, Kyren Williams and Rachaad White are my 2 favorite. And then I think just the savings with Edwards-Helaire as a guy who really should be a good bet for at least like 15 total touches in this game. Again, against a really bad Bengals defense. So I think Kyron Williams, Rashad White, and Edwards-Helaire will be my 3 cash game running backs.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly still the edge for McCaffrey over Kyron Williams, but Kyron Williams is right there at number 2 in half PPR points per game behind McCaffrey, and you get that significant salary saving. So it's tough to say go away from McCaffrey, but at some point you have to look at the price and have to factor it in pretty heavily. Tournament side, where are you differing at running back?
Yeah, I really like DeAndre Swift coming in at just 7% projected ownership on FanDuel, $7,600. Eagles 30-point implied total. That's second highest on the main slate behind only the 49ers. The Cardinals are 31st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. They're 31st in run defense DVOA. They're actually down to 32nd in run defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks now. I just think it's a perfect spot for Swift. I really think you want to try to get at least one Eagle on most of your teams just in this matchup at home against Arizona with the huge implied total. And I think Swift is, a good value, and he's going to be one of the, lower owned Eagles on this slate.
Yeah, if you can get the dominant lead running back for a team implied for 30 points, it already one of the best offenses in the league, and coming off 2 straight 20-touch games. I mean, it's just like a no-brainer, I think.
Just, Jalen Hurts, let DeAndre Swift score a couple touchdowns. Maybe
hand off himself.
Yeah, that one on what was that? That was Christmas, right? Where he looked like he was going to score easily and somehow just got stopped at the half-yard line, and in comes Jalen Hurts. But yeah, I mentioned it on the DraftKings segment, but 8.1 expected touchdowns for DeAndre Swift, which is 8th highest among running backs. He only has 5 actual touchdowns, so it's not even like he hasn't had the opportunity. Hurts is stealing a bunch of them, but Swift has still had chances to score. I think he'll start converting those, especially in this matchup.
Fingers crossed for Jason Kelce not tackling him at the 1-yard line. Yeah. At wide receiver, Rashee Rice is up to $7,400 in FanDuel salary, 5th in our FanDuel dollars per point still, though, because he's been doing great on targets lately, and it's a positive matchup. Jared, are we choosing between Rashee Rice and CEH for cash lineups, or maybe even playing both of them?
I'm not going to get to both of them. There are 3 wide receivers in the same price range that we actually have as better dollars per point values. And I think you definitely want to get one of them. It's possible to get 2 depending on what you do elsewhere. I'm starting with Michael Pittman at $7,700. He has 11 targets in 4 straight healthy games in 5 of his last 6. And he has 8+ catches in 6 straight games. Pretty unheard of consistency at this position. And he was a full go in practice on Thursday. So it looks like he'll be ready to return from his concussion. So as long as that's the case, I think Pittman is just kind of like the classic cash game play right now at wide receiver.
Who do you like on Turney's side of wideout?
Really like Chris Olave this week. And I think he's another guy that's in play for cash at $7,400 on FanDuel. He's projected for 11% ownership. So not sneaky. I think he should be projected for more than that, honestly. I think he's under owned if he comes in at 11%. Chris Olave over his last 5 games, 8.8 targets per game, 6.2 catches per game, 96 yards per game. And it's not like there's been one blow up game in that stretch. He has 94+ receiving yards in 4 of his last 5 games. He's topped 100 yards in 3 of his last 5. So he's just been super steady in terms of, both volume and receiving yardage. Gets the Bucs on Sunday. They're 30th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. The Bucs have allowed the 4th most yards per game to opposing number 1 wide receiver. So Olave's been very good for the past 5 weeks. I think there's still that blow up game in him where he's the guy you kind of have to win tournaments. And I think, Sunday's matchup could definitely, lead to that.
And facing a pass funnel defense that doesn't have a particularly good pass rush. So it should be a good spot for Chris Olave to produce, especially with a quarterback that's been playing well over the past few weeks. Tight end, we've got Travis Kelce, Trey McBride, and George Kittle up top in FanDuel dollars per point. Jared, why pay $1,000 more in FanDuel salary to get to Kelce as opposed to playing McBride against the Eagles this week?
Yeah, I wouldn't. I think Kelce still has the higher ceilings. He's just in the better offense. But floor wise, I think they're similar at this point. And McBride's volume has just been awesome. It's a good matchup for him. There should be plenty of volume on his side. So $6,800 is still a lot to pay in cash. I think if I can get there, I would love to, but I'm going to probably end up going down to Dallas Goedert, who, saves me another 1,000 even off of Trey McBride. Dallas Goedert, 9 targets in each of the last 2 games. The Cardinals are 5th in adjusted points allowed to tight ends. They just haven't faced a lot of tight end targets, 4th fewest tight end targets. They're 30th in tight end coverage DVOA. So it's not a scary matchup for Dallas Goedert. I think he's, just a safe bet in this matchup. Where really everyone on the Eagles, has a chance to have a big game against Arizona.
Turney side, what do you like at tight end this week?
I would love to get some Kelce and McBride. Kelce, especially against Cincinnati, who is dead last in adjusted points allowed to tight ends. They're really, there's been 1 blow up Kelsey game so far this season, but I think there's a chance we get a second in this matchup on Sunday. I also might play a little Darren Waller, who is probably like my most costly mistake in redraft season this year. Just way too much Darren Waller. It's been pretty much a lost season for him with the injuries, but he's been a full go in practice both last week and this week. He was up to a 71% route rate last week after being, limited in his return in week 15, but, close to full playing time last week. In Tyrod Taylor's 2 starts earlier this season, Darren Waller drew 23% of Taylor's targets. He gets the Rams, who are 25th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends, and Waller's coming in at just 3% projected ownership at $5,900. So if you're looking for a cheaper, lower owned tight end, I think it might make some sense to mix in Waller. That's a guy like you could game stack Waller with Kyron Williams or Waller with one of the Rams wide receivers and hope that game goes pretty high scoring.
Or at least that the Rams score a bunch of points and Darren Waller gets a bunch of targets while the Giants haplessly chase. Flex, what do you like on FanDuel this week?
Yeah, another Eagle that is a bit underowned, I think. Devonta Smith, 7% projected ownership, $7,200. So he's much cheaper than A.J. Brown. He's going to be lower owned than A.J. Brown. Over the last 5 games, Devonta Smith has 14.3 FanDuel points per game to A.J. Brown's 11.7. Brown's still beating Smith pretty easily in targets over that span. I think he is the better play. We haven't projected for significantly more fantasy points, but at the discount here and at the ownership discount with Smith as well, like he could easily outscore AJ Brown again in this game. And if he does, you're getting a pretty big advantage over the field.
It is worth noting that in the 3 games with Dallas Goedert back, we've seen Goedert go 4 targets. Devontae Smith had 10 in that one. Then Goedert had 9 targets each of the past 2 weeks, and Smith had just 5 in those 2 games. So, there is a risk factor at play there, but we know that with Devontae Smith, he is at least an efficient receiver when he does get those opportunities. What else do you like at Flex?
Yeah, and that was a thing last year with Devontae Smith too, where he got a big target boost in games without Dallas Goedert. So yeah, definitely, the floor is kind of low on Smith, but again, the upside's there in this matchup. I like Joe Mixon here on FanDuel as well. I mentioned in my DraftKings, but on FanDuel, he's coming in at 2% projected ownership, $7,300. I mean, the Chiefs' run D it was like 2 or 3 years ago where the Chiefs run D was just like god awful, and we played running backs against them all season. They're kind of back to that level at this point. 29th in run defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks, giving up 5.2 yards per carry to running back. So I think that the Bengals game plan in this one, especially with Jamar Chase likely out again, should be to try to get Mixon going on the ground and keep this game close for as long as possible. I think at 2% ownership and at this price tag, I think Mixon makes a lot of sense for tournaments.
We only need to look back to last week to see Zamir White going 22 for 145. A lot of that was late in the game when the Raiders were salting it away. But I mean, if the Chiefs are at the point where the Raiders can salt a game away against them late, then, that shows you that there's some potential for this to not go the way that the Vegas lines project it to go. So yeah, I like anytime that you can get like a pretty good clear lead running back at way low ownership, and especially if it's in a potentially positive matchup. I mean, he's somebody at least worth mixing in.
Yep, for sure.
Defense, the Broncos lead our dollars per point on both sites, DraftKings and FanDuel. And to me, they just feel like a better play this week, Jared. Chargers played better against the Bills last week than they did against the Raiders, of course. In Easton Stick's first start, they still allowed 5 sacks, even in that game that came down to the wire. So it's a positive matchup for sure.
Yeah, 10% sack rate for Easton Stick through his 3 games. He came in for most of the second half, or maybe even more than a half of that first game against the Broncos, took a couple sacks in that one. So just and a great spot for Denver at home. I think they're pretty easily the clear cash play on FanDuel. We do have them as, easily the best dollars per point value. I do also like Baltimore on FanDuel here. They're projected for 1% ownership right now, just $4,100. So their price is down. The matchup isn't great, but they've put up fantasy points against good offenses already this season, including last week against San Francisco, 15 FanDuel points in that one. I do think Atlanta is also in play here on FanDuel. We talked about them on yesterday's preview podcast, but Atlanta's up to 8th in defensive DVOA over the last 5 weeks, and they've scored fantasy points too. They have 12 plus FanDuel points in 3 of their last 5 games. The issue with Atlanta is they're projected for 10% ownership. So I'm not going to play them over Denver in cash, and then I don't really want to play them in tournaments if they're 10% ownership. So they're good value. They're worth mentioning, but I just don't really know how they fit in at this point.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think it's interesting to know that the defense on the other side of that, the Bears, are facing 1% projected ownership. 1% projected ownership right now. Their issue is the $4,400 salary. I mean, so if you get there and you still have salary left, maybe that's worth going up to because it is a high ceiling matchup, but I wouldn't force them in at the cost of another position in your lineup either.
Agreed. Totally.
Get more FanDuel recommendations and analysis from our pal Kevin English at draftsharks.com. He's got articles covering cash games and tournament play on FanDuel every week. We got one more FanDuel and DraftKings show coming at you next week for week 18. Of course, we won't have the regular preview show because it's just not a regular fantasy week. Most redraft leagues and tournaments will be done ahead of that one. But the lineup generator will keep working through the end of the season, helping you build your best cash and tournament lineups for play on FanDuel, on DraftKings, and on Yahoo every week. Our goal, of course, to help you win week 17.